Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep, really deep into a story that's, well, it's truly chilling. We're talking about Ed Gein.
Ed Gein, yeah, his name's almost synonymous with horror, isn't it?
Right, and I bet most of you have at least heard of him.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, how could you not? He's practically the blueprint for, like, every iconic horror villain.
Norman Bates.
Leatherface.
The list goes on and on. But, and here's the thing, the real story
Oh, yeah.
goes way beyond those Hollywood portrayals.
Deeper, much deeper.
So much deeper, yeah.
Yeah.
You were talking about a guy who inspired all these terrifying characters, but also a case that just raises all these unsettling questions about mental illness.
Yeah, yeah, and about, that darkness lurking beneath the surface of what seems like ordinary life.
Exactly. So to help us navigate this rather dark territory, we're going to be diving into an excerpt from biography.com.
Right?
It's titled Ed Gein, Biography, Murderer, Grave Robber, Monsters Season 3.
And it is a wild ride.
It really is. But our goal here, what we really want to do with this deep dive is, we want to go beyond the surface.
Beyond the headlines.
Beyond those sensationalized stories, right?
Yeah.
We want to try to understand the psychology, the cultural forces at play here.
I mean, it's a story that really makes you confront some uncomfortable truths, you know?
Absolutely.
Like, what makes a monster? Like, what is it? What's the recipe?
Yeah, and that's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Yeah.
So to start us off, let's just lay the groundwork. Who was Ed Gein? Give us the bare bones, the facts of the case.
Okay, so Ed Gein, convicted murderer.
Yeah.
Specifically, he was convicted of murdering a hardware store owner. Her name was Bernice Worden. This was back in 1957. But here's the thing. It wasn't just the murders that made him infamous. It was what they found
At his house.
at his home. It was truly horrifying. I mean, you can't even, like, it was like a nightmare. Like, you walk in, there's human remains, but they're fashioned into, like, furniture, clothing, masks. Can you imagine those investigators walking into that scene? I mean, the stench alone, the sheer depravity.
And that's how he got the nickname the Butcher of Plainfield.
Exactly. It's a name that's, well, it's stuck. And for good reason.
Yeah, for very disturbing reasons. Okay, so we have these horrific crimes, but what led him down this path? What happened?
Mm-hmm.
The article mentions a pretty troubled childhood, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you could say that his upbringing was, well, it was a breeding ground for a very warped worldview. His mother, Augusta, she was incredibly domineering and very religious, like to the point of being fanatical,
Mm-hmm.
And she instilled this sense of fear and guilt in Ed, especially when it came to women, sexuality, all of that.
And this is all happening in like rural Wisconsin, right?
Yeah.
Like an isolated farmhouse.
Oh, yeah. Talk about a recipe for disaster. Isolated environment.
Right.
Oppressive religious upbringing.
Yeah.
It's like a pressure cooker, right?
Just waiting to explode.
Waiting to blow. And then, to make matters worse, his father dies in 1940. And then a few years later, his brother Henry dies too, under mysterious circumstances.
Mysterious circumstances. What do you mean?
Well, some people believe that Ed might have had something to do with it, but it was never proven.
Wow.
But even if he wasn't directly involved, it points to a possible, escalation of those violent tendencies, even before his mother died, which is when things really went off the rails.
So his mother's death was like the catalyst for his downward spiral.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was pathologically devoted to his mother. He never dated.
Really?
Never left home. His entire world revolved around her. So when she died in 1945, it was like he lost his anchor, his only connection to reality.
And that's when he preserved her room, right?
Yeah, he kept it as a shrine.
Untouched.
While the rest of the house just, descended into this unbelievable squalor.
That's such a chilling detail. Like,
Yeah.
it almost foreshadows what's to come, this obsession with preserving the dead.
It's very telling, yeah. And around this time, that's when he starts reading anatomy books, like devouring them. And you can see how his interests, which, were always a bit on the macabre side, they start to fixate more and more on the human body.
But in a very unhealthy way,
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
So we have this isolated, mentally unstable individual with this morbid fascination with anatomy. What happens next? How does this lead to the crimes that he's ultimately convicted of?
Well, in 1957, the hardware store owner, Bernice Worden, she disappears. And suspicion immediately falls on Ed Gein. And it's actually her son, who is a deputy sheriff, that leads the authorities to Gein's farmhouse.
Oh, wow.
And what they find there, well, it becomes the stuff of legend.
Not the good kind, though.
Not the good kind, no.
Yeah. The article really doesn't hold back. It talks about, I mean, they found Bernice Worden's remains, of course, but also skulls used as bowls.
Yeah.
Skin fashioned into clothing. It's almost beyond comprehension.
It's the stuff of nightmares, really. And you have to understand, for the investigators, it wasn't just about documenting the horror. They were trying to understand it. What could drive someone to do this, to desecrate bodies in such a way?
Yeah, and that brings us to Gein's psychological profile, right? The article mentions that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Right, he was.
And while a diagnosis like that certainly doesn't excuse his actions,
Of course not.
it does maybe provide some context.
Absolutely. I mean, schizophrenia, it involves distorted perceptions of reality, hallucinations, difficulty distinguishing what's real and what's not. So you can imagine with Gein, those symptoms, coupled with his isolation, his unhealthy attachment to his mother,
Right.
it's a recipe for
Madness.
Yeah, for madness.
It's almost like you wonder if things could have been different. If early intervention or a different environment could have, I don't know, maybe altered his trajectory.
That's the question that haunts a lot of these cases, nature versus nurture, and what role society plays in failing to identify and treat people who are struggling.
The big question.
Yeah.
And then there's the term necrophilia. It's mentioned in the article.
Right.
And it's a difficult topic, but it seems pretty central to understanding Gein's motivations.
Yeah.
So could you explain a little bit about what that is and how it fits into all of this?
Sure. So necrophilia is a sexual attraction to corpses.
Right.
And it is a very disturbing aspect of Gein's case.
Yeah.
The way he interacts with the bodies, the clothing made of skin, it all points to this deep-seated and very twisted fascination with the dead.
And it's not just a random fascination with death.
No.
It's somehow tied to this unhealthy attachment to his mother.
That's what makes it so psychologically complex,
Yeah.
It's possible that in his mind, he was trying to recreate some kind of connection to his mother through these acts. But instead of seeking healthy human connection, he turned to the dead. He blurred the lines between fantasy and reality in the most horrifying way imaginable.
Yeah, no wonder he earned those chilling nicknames. The Butcher of Plainfield.
The Plainfield Ghoul.
These names, they're more than just labels, right?
Right.
They reflect society's attempt to grapple with something so horrifying, so incomprehensible.
I think they're almost a way of distancing ourselves from the horror, But by giving him a monstrous name, we separate ourselves from the very human darkness he represents. But the truth is, his story forces us to confront that darkness, that it can exist anywhere.
Even in the most unassuming places.
Yeah.
And that leads us to the question of what happened after his arrest.
Right.
I mean, a case this disturbing, it couldn't just end there.
Oh, no, it doesn't. Not at all. Gein's arrest, that was just the beginning, really, of another chapter in this macabre story,
I bet. I mean, 1957. That wasn't that long ago. I can only imagine the headlines, the public fascination, all of that.
Oh, it was a media sensation for sure.
Yeah.
Fueled by, the nature of the crimes, but also all those questions they raised about, sanity and culpability, all that.
Yeah. So what happened at the trial? Was he found guilty?
Well, it wasn't exactly straightforward. See, Gein's lawyer, he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity.
Okay.
And after some psychological evaluations, Gein was actually deemed unfit to stand trial.
Oh, wow.
And he was committed to a mental institution in Wisconsin.
So he never actually faced a jury?
Not for those initial crimes, no. It wasn't until 1968, so almost a decade later, that he was considered fit to stand trial to participate in his own defense.
And what happened then?
Well, even then, the outcome was still really shaped by his mental state, He was found guilty of murder,
Okay.
but legally insane at the time of the crime. So instead of prison, he was sent back to the mental institution.
So it's really interesting. His case kind of highlights how complex the criminal justice system is.
Oh, yeah.
Especially when it comes to dealing with mental illness. Like, how do you punish someone who might not fully understand the gravity of their actions?
Right. And it's a question that, we're still grappling with it today.
For sure. For sure. But even after all that time in the institution, he was still considered too dangerous to be released.
Exactly. And I think that speaks to the profound and lasting impact of his crimes, not just on the victims, on their families, but on society as a whole,
Yeah.
Like, even in death, Gein couldn't escape the shadow of what he'd done.
Speaking of his death, the article mentions that his grave became kind of a macabre tourist attraction. Like, people were chipping off pieces of his tombstone as souvenirs.
Yeah, it's a bizarre twist, isn't it? Like people were drawn to his grave like it was some kind of dark pilgrimage. The tombstone was actually stolen at one point, later recovered, but now his grave is unmarked.
Wow. It's like even in death, society couldn't figure out what to do with him.
Right. How to reconcile the man with the monster.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a bit. Maybe move to a slightly less morbid topic.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Gain's impact on pop culture.
Sure.
I mean, you mentioned earlier that he inspired some of the most iconic horror villains.
Hey, absolutely. It's strange, isn't it, that these horrific crimes actually had this lasting influence on the horror genre. But I mean, filmmakers, they saw in Gein's story this raw, primal horror, and I mean, they weren't wrong.
Yeah. Two of the biggest examples that immediately come to mind are Psycho
Mm-hmm.
and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Oh, yeah. Classic.
It's almost hard to believe that one man's depravity could, I don't know, could fuel so much creative, albeit terrifying output.
It's the power of the story, right? How it tapped into this deep-seated fear within all of us, I think.
Yeah. Okay, let's start with Psycho. The article mentions that Robert Bloch, the author of the novel Psycho, was directly inspired by Gein.
He was.
What was it about Gein's story that resonated so strongly? Was it just the murders, or was it something more specific?
I mean, yeah, the murders were shocking, but I think it was more than that. It was Gein's unhealthy attachment to his dead mother that really captured Bloch's imagination.
Right, because Gein kept his mother's room untouched.
Exactly,
Yeah.
like a shrine.
So it's like Norman Bates and his whole twisted relationship with his mother, his inability to separate himself from her, even after death,
Mm-hmm.
that's directly inspired by Gein.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Bloch took this real-life horror and transformed it into this psychological thriller.
And then Hitchcock, when he directed the film adaptation, he really amplified those psychological elements, didn't he?
Masterfully. He understood that the real horror wasn't the physical violence, it was what was happening in Norman Bates' mind. That's what made the film so terrifying, so effective.
It's amazing how they took this real-life case and, all its gruesome details and crafted a story that explores these deeper, more unsettling psychological themes.
They weren't just recreating events, they were using Gein's story to explore these bigger questions about identity, sanity.
The dark potential that lurks within all of us.
Exactly. And what about Texas Chainsaw Massacre? That's a bit different, right?
Yeah, the article mentions that it's less of a direct adaptation, more like borrowing elements from Gein's case.
Right. It's definitely a much more visceral approach, less psychological, more, in your face. It's just this relentless, bloody, chaotic film. But it reflects a different aspect of Gein's, legacy, his craftsmanship.
We're talking about the masks, the suits made from human skin?
Exactly.
Really?
Leatherface, the killer. He wears the faces of his victims.
Yeah.
It creates this really disturbing sense of, depersonalization, a complete disregard for human life. And, that raw primal horror, it just taps into our deepest fears about vulnerability, violation, all of that.
So both films, even though they're so different in their approach,
Mm-hmm.
they both kind of tap into this same underlying dread, right?
Mhm.
The violation of the human body, the transgression
Yeah.
of boundaries that we consider sacred.
Right, and that transgression, that's what makes Gein's story so disturbing, even all these years later.
Yeah.
He violated something fundamental about our understanding of
Mm.
of humanity.
And we're still trying to make sense of it, right?
It's like we're drawn to it, but at the same time repulsed by it. We want to understand it, but we'd rather not think about it.
It's a paradox.
It is, and that paradox, that's what keeps Gein's case so compelling, so enduring. It makes us confront that darkness.
Not just in the world, but in ourselves.
Exactly.
And it seems like we're still uncovering new pieces of this puzzle, even now, all these years later. The article mentions this 2023 docuseries, Psycho, The Lost Tapes of Ed Gein, which features, never-before-heard audio from Gein's interrogation.
Isn't that wild? After all this time, there's still new insights to be gleaned. It really shows the lasting power of this story.
Yeah. It's like we're still trying to find meaning in the madness, or extract some lesson from something that seems inherently senseless.
You got it. We're drawn to Gein's story not just for the shock value, but because it raises these big questions about the nature of evil, the limits of sanity.
The dark potential within us all.
Yeah. And speaking of exploring those dark depths, did you know that Ryan Murphy's Netflix series, Monster, is going to focus on Gein in its upcoming season?
Really?
Yeah. Charlie Hunnam's going to play him, which I think is an interesting casting choice, you know?
It'll be interesting to see how they handle such a complex and controversial figure.
Right. Like, will they focus on the graphic details of his crimes, or will they delve into the psychology, his motivations?
Will they try to portray him as a sympathetic figure?
Yeah. Like, a victim of his upbringing, his mental illness.
Or will they focus on, I don't know, on the monster?
The cold-blooded killer.
Yeah. Either way, I'm sure it's going to generate a lot of buzz. Gein's story has that effect on people, doesn't it?
It does.
Repellent.
And I think that's why it's so valuable. From a cultural and even a psychological perspective, it forces us to ask those uncomfortable questions, to confront the darkness that exists, not just out there, but,
In here,
Yeah.
it's a reminder that the monsters we fear, well, they aren't always lurking in the shadows.
Sometimes they're much closer than we think.
And that's a thought. Wow, that's a thought. It's incredible. Even though Ed Gein's crimes happened, decades ago,
Yeah.
his story still has such a hold on us. Why is that? What is it about Gein that continues to fascinate us, horrify us? All of it.
It's a question that, well, it keeps a lot of people up at night. Researchers, filmmakers, true crime fans, you name it. I think on one level, there's the shock value, right? The pure gruesomeness of it all, the bodies, the desecration. It taps into something primal, a fear that we're, I don't know, maybe hardwired with. We're horrified, but we can't look away.
It's like that morbid curiosity we all have, right?
Yeah.
I shouldn't be looking at this, but I can't help myself kind of thing.
Exactly, but I think it goes deeper than just the gore. I think Gin's story, it reflects these anxieties we all have about isolation, about mental illness, about the darkness that exists in people who seem, ordinary. Like he was a monster, but he was also a product of his environment, right? A deeply troubled individual who, I don't know, he slipped through the cracks.
And that's what makes it so unsettling.
Yeah.
It's like anyone, given the wrong set of circumstances, could potentially, I don't know, go down a similar path. Like it challenges our assumptions about good and evil.
Yeah.
About the boundaries that we think separate us from the darkness.
Exactly. Gin's case, it forces us to confront that fragility of the human psyche, the blurred lines between what's normal and what's madness. It reminds us that evil doesn't, it doesn't always show up with horns and a tail.
Right.
It can be quiet, unassuming, hiding in plain sight.
It's like that phrase from the docuseries, a monster in plain sight.
Oh, yeah.
So chilling and so true when you think about him. And in a way, I think it reflects our own unease about the hidden depths of human nature.
Yeah. That phrase, it just nails it, doesn't it? It really captures how unsettling his story is. And it reminds us that we can never really know what's lurking beneath the surface.
In others, yeah, but also in ourselves. And maybe that's the most terrifying part of his legacy, that realization, the monsters we fear, they might be closer than we think.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive.
It's a heavy one.
It is. And disturbing. We've really gone beyond the headlines, haven't we? And delved into, the psychological complexities of Ed Gein, the man, the myth, the monster.
I went there.
But I feel like we've uncovered more questions than answers, which I guess is often the case with these deep dives. Well, that's what happens when you explore the dark side of human nature, right? It raises more questions than it answers. But those questions, they're valuable. They make us think critically, examine our own assumptions about good and evil, just grapple with the realities of the world.
If any of our listeners out there are, as captivated by Ed Gein's story as we are, where would you point them? What resources would you recommend? For further exploration, of course.
Well, that docuseries we mentioned, Psycho, The Lost Tapes of Ed Gein, that's a great place to start, especially if you're interested in hearing Gein's own words, and the perspectives of the people who investigated him. There's also a ton of books, articles, all that delve into all the different sides of the case, legal, psychological, his impact on pop culture. And of course, there's that upcoming season of Monster, which would be interesting to see how they interpret his life.
So much to explore. Well, thank you for guiding us through this deep dive. It was chilling, but also thought-provoking.
You got it.
And to our listeners, well, we encourage you to keep those minds curious.
But maybe sleep with the lights on tonight, just in case.
Good advice. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
Remember, guys, the most disturbing truths, well, they often teach us the most about ourselves. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.